first presenter of our session will be Marina Lupishko. Marina holds a PhD in musicology from Cardiff University. She was Alexander Humboldt's postdoctoral fellow and a grant holder at Jacobs University Bremen, among others. She will speak us about trying to reconsider the significance of Čiurlionis in the concept of the so-called Russian Gesamtkunstwerk Tradition, and later she will discuss also about the problematic situation considering the musical paintings of Čiurlionis. So we have half an hour presentation and discussion. Thank you so much.
Yes, hello. Hello, I'm Marina Lupishko. I'm originally from the Ukraine, Kharkiv, so I would like to thank you for organizing this conference and for supporting Ukraine. It's very important for us all. My topic here, it's called Čiurlionis, his musical paintings, and the tradition of the so-called Russian Gesamtkunstwerk. So, when discussing tendencies toward synthesis of the art in my publications, I usually highlight a special group of Čiurlionis' contemporaries, the representatives of the so-called Wagnerian generation, all born in the 1860s and 1870s in the Russian Empire, in chronological order of birthday. Mikhail Matyushin, Vasily Kandinsky, Vyacheslav Ivanov, Leon Bakst, Nikolai Kulbin, Alexander Benoit, Alexander Skrabin, Serge Diaghilev, Nicolas Erich, and last but not least, Čiurlionis. This generation is a bit older than the generation of the next generation of modernist artists and musicians like, for example, Stravinsky or Larionov and Goncharova. So these people, they wanted to continue the ideals of Richard Wagner and to take them further. They all spoke about Wagner in one way or another. Unlike Wagner, who considered decor and architecture secondary to music and drama, several Russian artists, for example, Kandinsky or Benoit, in their search for a Gesamtkunstwerk, relied on a different combination: music, dance, and stage design, with the predominance of two visual components, design and dance, over the auditory one, music. In his comprehensive monograph, The Total Work of Art in European Modernism, David Roberts calls this new concept a post-Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk. In this new triangle, Wagner's main dilemma, music or drama, is, as it were, bypassed. Indeed, the question of the redundancy or the necessity of a dramatic plot was on the agenda both in Europe and in Russia in the early 1900s, as a reaction to excessive naturalism and realism of the visual arts, literature, poetry, music, and theater at the end of the previous century. It seems to me that Čiurlionis' desire for the Gesamtkunstwerk, which was particularly strong towards the end of his short life, was, so to speak, double-edged. This aspiration in the era of transition from symbolism to modernism, through a bridge, so to speak, from Wagnerism to post-Wagnerism and back, which was not always chronologically logical, which partly resembles Skrabin's vacillations between post-Wagnerism and Wagnerism, between the post-Wagnerian Prometheus, the poem of fire, a combination of music and colored light, lacking a detailed literary program, and the unfinished Mysterium, which was to be based on a solid poetic text. In 1908-1909, Čiurlionis' project of the opera Jūratė, Queen of the Baltic, of which only a few pencil sketches of the decor survive, was supposed to have a solid literary basis too. The libretto was to be written by Sofija Kymantaitė, Čiurlionis' wife, a professional writer and connoisseur of Lithuanian culture. Taking as a whole, as a combination of aesthetic, metaphysical, and socio-political aspects, Those are the three aspects of any Gesamtkunstwerk. Synthesis of the art, Lithuanian pre-Christian mythology, and revival of Lithuanian culture. The finished product of this collaboration was supposed to approach as close as possible the Gesamtkunstwerk ideals of Wagner's Bayreuth period. This same aspiration, albeit tinged with, shall we say, more wattle-colored tones, is evident in the composer Čiurlionis' constant interest in program music, on the one hand, and in the painter Čiurlionis' constant interest in the post-Wagnerian genre of musical painting, on the other, which we'll discuss later. Most importantly, he desired to be both a visual artist and a composer, and even a poet, which is evident from his letters to his brother Povilas. It seems to me a hypothesis born in the course of reading literature about Čiurlionis, a hypothesis that still needs to be verified, that in the last years of his life and work, Čiurlionis was under the influence, more or less noticeable, of the Russian artist and art critic Alexander Nikolaevich Benois. It even seems to me that a non-Russian native of a distant province of the Russian Empire, Čiurlionis, was able to unite and to reconcile, to some extent, the two competing poles of, or the two creative clusters of the Gesamtkunstwerk of the Russian avant-garde, the Paris-St. Petersburg cluster, through his connection with the group World of Art, and particularly with Benois, as well as with Mstislav Dobuzinski, Konstantin Somov, Eugène Lanceray, Sergei Makovsky, Nicolas Rerik, Walter Nouvel, and others. And the Munich-Moscow cluster, represented, among others, by the circles of Scriabin and Kandinsky. Having arrived in St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1908, armed with a letter of recommendation from Vilnius-based contemporary of Čiurlionis, but already well-known artist and set designer, recommendation from Vilnius-based artist and critic Levan Tokolsky, Čiurlionis approached Mstislav Dobuzinski, a contemporary of Čiurlionis, but already a well-known artist and set designer. Dobuzinski was a native of Lithuania. His works had also been exhibited in Vilnius in 1908. Dobuzinski, who had been on friendly terms with Benois since 1903, brought Čiurlionis into the circle of artists of the World of Art and promoted his advancement. In his apartment, he organized a viewing of Čiurlionis' paintings by Benois, Makovsky, Bakst, Somov, and Lanceray in the autumn of 1908. Dobuzinski should also be credited with bringing Čiurlionis to Benois' home for the latter's soirée, the equivalent of Vyacheslav Ivanov's Ivory Tower gatherings, in a large, cozy bourgeois apartment in which Čiurlionis was literally warming himself up. Čiurlionis remained in St. Petersburg for long periods of time because he was accepted into the circle of artists of the World of Art as a like-minded person. Perhaps he wanted to concentrate in his new opera project all the impulses for a synthesis of the arts scattered throughout his life. As we remember, the program that Diaghilev wrote down of the magazine World of Art had synthesis of the art inside of it. Okay, so it was a program long on the agenda at the time. Wanting, and of course, Benois at this time would be working on Pavillon d'Armide, the first ballet that was staged during the Ballet Russe season of 1909, and later on he would produce with Stravinsky and Fokin the Petrushka masterpiece. So, wanting to clarify not only, perhaps Čiurlionis wanted to concentrate in his new opera project all the impulses for a synthesis of the arts scattered throughout his life. Sofia expressed the program of their future collaboration, in a letter to her husband as follows, I quote, "One must reach the bottom, one must rise as high as possible." Wanting to glorify not only his name but also that of his young wife, and to create the first Lithuanian national synthesis of the arts based on the tragic story of a sea princess who falls in love with a simple fisherman, Čiurlionis may have briefly discussed this project with Benois or Dobuzinski, or both.
In any case, some discussion definitely took place, of which Benoit recalls some 30 years later. In 1938, Benoit recalled that back in 1908, he was still taken back by the Lithuanian artist's dilettantism. But a year later, after a personal meeting, he changed his mind. I quote from Benoit, "Here I met the author of this attempt, and this acquaintance finally convinced me of the authenticity of his art. No trace of being a proud genius, no posing, no pretentious speed. In a word, none of that which is so often found in people who consider themselves quite exalted, but are in fact empty and talentless. On the contrary, his entire appearance and manner of speech expressed a certain calm that even created an impression of a certain humiliation and almost suffocation. At the same time, something unusually worthy and affectionate emanated from this man," unquote. In Čiurlionis, Benoit recognized a kindred spirit, for that was exactly what he was himself: modest, hardworking, matter-of-fact, and easy to talk to. At the same time, the aura of a teacher, a guru, was hanging over Benoit throughout all his life. In Dabužinski's letters to Benoit, the letter is addressed as "my teacher." The list of Benoit's students also included, by the way, Diaghilev, Bakst, Stravinsky, and many other illustrious names. In his turn, Čiurlionis fell under the spell of Benoit's personal charm, his artistic taste, and his enormous erudition. Moreover, it was not only their non-Russian origins, their Catholic faith, and their interest in the synthesis of the arts that brought these two men together. They were also drawn together by their shared views on the essence of art. As early as 1898, Benoit had begun a polemic with Diaghilev, the founder and editor-in-chief of the World of Art magazine, with an article entitled "On the Storytelling Quality in Painting." It was directed against the art for the art's sake focus of the Mir Искусство magazine that Diaghilev and his co-editor Dmitry Filosofov would formulate in the editor's note. The article remained unpublished, and the resulting incident marked the first of a long series of rifts and coolings between the two friends. Distancing himself from the anecdotal literary nature of the art of the передвижники, on which Benoit agreed with Filosofov and Diaghilev, he simultaneously distanced himself from the principle l'art pour l'art. In Benoit's view, great works of art always reveal a hidden, veiled morality. He calls it implicit narrative. Such an implicit narrative is achieved by formal means only. It has a right to exist and should not be ignored. Benoit cites, as an example, Peter Bruegel's The Elder, The Census at Bethlehem. The painting, a Dutch winter cityscape, presents the episode from the New Testament as an antithesis between the hidden presence of Virgin Mary on a donkey, and Joseph in front with a saw on his shoulders, in the mass of ordinary faceless people, and the enormously important cosmic event that is soon to follow. I'm going to show you again. So, the two things connected Benoit and Čiurlionis: an interest in a synthesis of the arts in its post-Wagnerian, non-literary variant on the one hand, and the belief that true art should always have a content on the other. Perhaps the overwhelming burden of the first national Lithuanian Gesamtkunstwerk in its Wagnerist form hastened Čiurlionis' mental illness and death. This possibility cannot be discounted, as Scriabin also departed from life suddenly, in the prime of his life, crushed by the weight of his own grandiose Gesamtkunstwerk plans. It is not surprising, for even Mozart himself had sacrificed life on the altar of art, having fallen victim of his own insatiable thirst for the Gesamtkunstwerk of his own era, the opera. A contemporary of Čiurlionis, Scriabin, I will go back perhaps, here, Čiurlionis is surrounded by Scriabin and Kandinsky. A contemporary of Čiurlionis, Scriabin knew about the existence of his Lithuanian colleague, visited the posthumous exhibition of his paintings in Moscow in 1911, and spoke highly about him, although not entirely in his favor. Leonid Sabaneyev recorded Scriabin saying, I quote, Čiurlionis is somewhat too ghostly. There is no real power in him, as he does not want his dream to become reality. This statement shows that Scriabin unfortunately understood little about painting. According to Sabaneyev, Scriabin in painting valued plot and mystical idea more than color and execution. Comparisons between Čiurlionis and Scriabin understandably proliferated in the 1910s, in the second half of 1910s. This parallel was first drawn, as if in passing, in Vyacheslav Ivanov's 1914 publication, Čiurlionis and the Problem of the Synthesis of the Art. Nikolai Berdyaev, in his 1911 essay, The Crisis of Art, criticized Ivanov for his individualistic concept of sobornost and denied Čiurlionis' artistic innovativeness altogether, while extolling Scriabin's desire to transcend the boundaries of art in general. In 1916, Rosa Neumarch, in her book, The Russian Art, described Čiurlionis' method as a translation of music into terms of pictorial art and proposed Čiurlionis as the ideal decorator for Scriabin's Mysterium. Röhrig concluded in 1936 that Čiurlionis and Scriabin had much in common, both in style and character, and that, I quote, with its uniqueness and persuasiveness, both artists, each in their own field, for this edition, special thanks go to Röhrig, each in their own field, stirred many young minds, unquote. In her 1999 article, Irina Vanichkina attempted to examine the connection between Scriabin and Čiurlionis. It is generally believed, says the author, that Scriabin took the first step toward a synthesis of the art, svita muzika, she says, in music, and Čiurlionis in painting. So they pursued a common goal along different paths. Vanichkina continues to bill her symmetry further, noting that both were outstanding musicians and multi-talented persons, as Scriabin was the author of philosophical and poetic texts for his works and potentially a light designer, she says, художник света. Both composers used the complex tonic, the principle of seriality, and modes with a symmetrical structure. The similarities with Scriabin are obvious, with the latter's greater emphasis on the creative self, concludes the author. Kandinsky, who also came to painting from a different occupation, law, rather late in life, had a keen interest in Čiurlionis. Kandinsky became acquainted with his work at the Salon of the Union of Russian Artists and through reproductions that appeared in 1910-1911 in the magazine Apollon, where he himself collaborated as a journalist. Kandinsky must have also read the high praise given to Čiurlionis by Benoit, and he invited Čiurlionis to participate in an exhibition of his association in Munich in September 1910, when the latter was already hospitalized. Kandinsky was impressed by the works of Čiurlionis, and Felix Rosiner even goes as far as to find that their compositions had a suspicious similarity. He talks about landscape with the locomotive near Murnau that reminds the composition of Čiurlionis' first painting from the day cycle. After Vorobyov's book of 1938, which was the first to draw a comparison between the two artists, and the post-World War II issue of primacy in the invention of abstract art raised by Alexis Ranit in his polemic with Nina Kandinsky, attention to the Čiurlionis-Kandinsky pair remains unwaned. Although the question of primacy still remains unresolved, it is already gratifying to know that Čiurlionis was included in the long list along with Kupka, Klee, Robert Delaunay, Mondrian, Picabia, Larionov, and Malevich. I personally doubt that Čiurlionis needs any longer the support of the two crutches on both sides, so to say, Scriabin and Kandinsky. Čiurlionis differs from them in three important ways. First of all, he differs from the monodisciplinary Kandinsky and Scriabin by his serious and comprehensive approach to both professional careers, musician and artist, until the end of his life, as evidenced, for example, by the concept of the opera Jurate. His great interest in music, notwithstanding, Kandinsky remained amateur musician, while Vyacheslav Ivanov called Scriabin's poetry scribbling behind his back. Second, Čiurlionis differs from the city dwellers Kandinsky and Scriabin, and we might add also Vyacheslav Ivanov, in his love and devotion to his small homeland, the rural Lithuania. Čiurlionis' complex ethnic identity, which could be called Baltic without any stretch, a Lithuanian with German roots, educated in Poland and Germany, and speaking Polish better than Lithuanian, and his commitment to the idea of creating a national Lithuanian culture distinguish him clearly from the cosmopolitans Kandinsky and Scriabin and Vyacheslav Ivanov. Third, a son of a rural organist, he differs from Kandinsky and Scriabin, who had a bourgeois origin and the material comfort that goes with it, by his very modest, low-class background. Unlike Scriabin and Kandinsky in Moscow, Čiurlionis did not feel at home in the huge metropolis of the northern Russian capital. And this contrast between the village house Druskininkai, which gave him energy, and St. Petersburg, which took this energy away, darkened the last years of Čiurlionis and possibly even pushed him to his grave. The fourth difference stems from the second and the third. Absolutely alien to narcissism, Čiurlionis surpassed his two Russian peers in empathy. Atkins speaks of Čiurlionis' mesmerizing ability to engage our empathy in such works as Fairy Tale of the Kings, Friendship, and The Truth. I would also like to add the second part of the triptych about the princess's journey, Fairy Tale 2, on the left-hand side. Raza Zhukiene notes that as a student in Warsaw in 1906, Čiurlionis read books on psychology on how empathy is generated. In Leipzig, he attended university lectures of the psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, who developed the concept of affect. If a parallel with the Russian avant-garde is still needed, then I see it more in Čiurlionis' spiritual proximity to Mikhail Matushin, a professional musician and composer in his first career, who came from a big family with a peasant background, and who shared Čiurlionis' love for the pine-covered Baltic coast at Usikirko, present name Palyany, halfway between Vyborg and St. Petersburg. Another unexpected parallel between Čiurlionis and Matushin is that both had wives that were writers, which allowed them both to engage in so-called homegrown Gesamtkunstwerk. Although Matushin's second wife, Yelena Guro, was not only a poet, but also an outstanding artist. There are also other similarities. For example, they started painting from Polish people. Matushin started painting with Tian Gliński, for example. And there is also another similarity in that Matushin started composing music and advancing in painting at the same time in 1905. So the two talents converged at some point, you know. A carefully thought-out composition and a sophisticated color scheme in Čiurlionis' painting offer another parallel with Matushin's art and theories. Matushin published the only book on the color theory of 1932, which I analyzed recently in my latest publication. A quote from the 1911 publication by the art critic Sergei Makovsky could be easily applied to both. I quote, "This musician, this visionary, was also a magician of color, a subtle understander of color relationships." 5 minutes, okay. Matushin and Čiurlionis are also similar in the way they both produced what we now call musical paintings. There are musical composition, pictorial musical compositions that I didn't represent here, but on the right-hand side there is one of them, for example. This post-Wagnerian idea appeared in almost every publication about Čiurlionis from 1910s. It was seized upon by the modernist-minded public seeking to banish subject matter from art for good. The problem is that Čiurlionis' paintings are musical not only in terms of their formal or cyclic structures, but also in graphic quality, in rhythms, textures, and affects. The musical mood of Čiurlionis' painting was noted already by Ivanov himself in 1914. Benoit remarked in 1938 that the most musical aspect of his painting is the harmony of colors. I would especially like to see, again, says Benoit, the well-chosen colors of Čiurlionis, precisely those in which his musicality was revealed to an even greater extent than in the lines and forms. In 1965, Mark Etkin identified linearity and graphic rhythm as the painter's governing musical category. In 1989, Fyodorov, an author of a very important book on the musical principles, the polyphonic principles in Čiurlionis. Fyodorov allowed himself to hint that the phrase musical painting is a convenient euphemism, allowing one to bypass the problem of the content of Čiurlionis' art. Here's what he writes further, I quote, "In paintings constructed on the principle of counterpoint of associations, the depicted space is bifurcated, containing two images, a real one and a fantastic one. For example, serenity. In the viewer's perception, the image is often bifurcated into the real and the fantastic. The viewer's consciousness requires a certain amount of time to transit from one association to the other." Unquote. Here we encounter Shklovsky's concept of отстранение, estrangement, the deliberate slowing down of the aesthetic reaction in order to break the viewer's, the listener's, or the reader's automatic perception. Benoit had already noted this in 1910. I quote, "Three fantasies by Čiurlionis evoke particularly tormenting and simultaneously nightmarishly sweet sensations in me. These are the Black Sun, the Lost Painting, the Cemetery, and Paradise. I think the most characteristic of Čiurlionis is the second of these two themes, conveyed by the artist with unprecedented strangeness." He says strangeness at this point. So I just wanted to finish with giving a little bit of my own work on Yakov Druskin that I did as my postdoc in Germany. A very similar concept, he called it emphasis, was developed by the philosopher Yakov Druskin, the elder brother of Mikhail Druskin, a friend of Daniel Harms, in the 1930s at the Bach Study Circle of the Leningrad Conservatory. I refer you to my article on the subject. Here's just one quote. "Sometimes it seems to me that in order to understand Bach, one has to know how to play his music. Only by playing Bach is one able to understand all the inconvenience of his music for one's fingers and for one's soul. His love for passing notes, suspensions, lingering on the fourth scale degree, unfinished cadences. He has understood the small error in a certain equilibrium." Unquote. The last. Genrich Arlov, an informal student of Yakov Druskin, calls the sound space in Bach's music a sacred space, сакральное пространство, where above and below are absolute and irreversible spiritual qualities. We have already heard about that in guest lectures. It is precisely by the way in which his favorite motifs, Druskin would call them hieroglyphs, and I did my publication of 2019 about hieroglyphs in Druskin, how they are juxtaposed in the works of Čiurlionis: a bird, an angel, a boat, a human hand, a ladder, a bell tower, the sun, the stars, the Milky Way, a flower, a tree, sea storm, thunderbolt, etc., 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 that we are able to speak also of a sacred space in Čiurlionis' pictorial art. In his article, The Star of Nonsense, Yakov Druskin tells us the following, I quote, "Combining different kinds of nonsense can clarify rather than obscure the meaning of the work of art." There are dozens and dozens of testimonies that Čiurlionis was in no hurry to explain the content of his painting. To end, let me quote an eyewitness account from Paulus Gaulane, the first compiler of the Čiurlionis' catalogue. I quote, "The first painting by Čiurlionis I saw was Prelude and Fugue. True, I didn't understand it very well, but it evoked many profound feelings in my soul, taught me to look more deeply at art, and yes, you're right when you say that clear thoughts don't always make a deep impression." Thank you.
Thank you. So, works? Okay, thank you, Marina, so much. We have a time for a very short question and a very short answer. In case there is no question, just want to inform my Lithuanian colleagues that there was a controversy in New York at the beginning of this month. Does anybody know about it? No, it was the embassy of Lithuania in United States posted that regarding the event Sounds and Echoes of the Empire at the Fisher Center at Bard College, there was a presentation presenting Čiurlionis as a paratactic Russian composer. 2025, okay? So there was a controversy and there were similar discussions that they were done in New York a couple of weeks ago.